Hi, everybody. This is Adam Ellenboss. It is Sunday, September 23rd, and we are going to talk about the fall equinox today. Um, we are going to be talking about both the fall equinox and the basic or general meaning of the sun in Libra. Now, for thousands of years, astrologers have considered the equinoxes and solstices of the solar year to be a defining feature of the zodiac. So in many ways, the zodiac is actually defined by equinoxes and solstices. And the basic reason for this is that in the West, we use what's called a tropical zodiac. And the tropical zodiac is defined by the four quadrature divisions of the solar year into four seasons, and they are those four seasons are arranged by the equinoxes and solstices. So in our zodiacal system, 0 Aries, the starting point of the zodiac, always coincides with the spring equinox. Which is also the starting point of spring. And then we have 0 Cancer as the defining or starting point of summer. And then we have 0 Libra as the defining or starting point of the autumn, coinciding with the fall equinox, Cancer with the summer solstice. And then we have 0 Capricorn and the winter solstice coinciding with the beginning of winter. So that's how our zodiac is divided up. Now, not everybody knows that in ancient astrology, prior to the advent of a sidereal versus a tropical zodiac, the two were actually probably one. And we can see this because earliest astrology, during the time of the early Hellenistic sort of origin era of astrology, the stars that we associate with the 12 signs of the zodiac were more or less aligned with the equinoxes and solstices, such that both the constellations and the seasonal markers of the year were all sort of together. And so the original zodiac was, in a sense, sidereal from the standpoint of having the stars also aligned with as sort of boundary markers for the 12 mathematical portions of the zodiacal circle. But of course, over time, we started noticing that the stars are drifting relative to the equinox and solstice points. And so what we see is a division of two different kinds of zodiacs, a sidereal zodiac and a tropical zodiac. Now, I'm not going to get into a debate about the two today. There's plenty of that out there. But suffice it to say that in the West, you'll see the quote-unquote Western astrology, which has its roots in the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the entire sort of Mesopotamian region of the world, the Mediterranean and Hellenistic world, that we stick with a seasonally defined zodiac where the zodiac is organized as 12 signs around the equinoxes and solstices. So it's very significant to look at the solstice and equinox points during the year, because in a sense, what's occurring around these four moments of the solar year will in some ways define the entire 90 days or the entire season of 3 concurrent signs in a row, or 3 signs in a row, excuse me. You'll have, for example, Libra, Scorpio, and Sagittarius in this season. And in some ways, what's happening right now, you could think of as like the new moon of the season. Not at all a new moon happening right now, but the idea is similar, that the energy of the equinox in some ways defines things to come for a while, that it's a powerful moment in the same way that a new or a full moon might sort of stand out as a powerful moment. So we look at equinoxes in depth sometimes. For example, mundane astrologers will look very carefully at the Libra the Libra ingress when the sun moves into Libra, or the Aries ingress when the sun moves into Aries. And they'll see, at what city in the world is this equinox taking place at high noon? In other words, where is the sun at the midheaven somewhere around the earth when the Libra ingress occurs or the Aries ingress. And there will be predictions oftentimes based upon like mundane predictions for cities, nations, peoples, etc., based on these ingresses. And similarly, in personal or natal astrology, we look at the Aries Libra ingress, or even the solstices for me too. And I look and I see what's going on in my chart, what's going on in my clients' charts. You can get a lot of information about not every equinox or solstice is going to be super impactful for you, but sometimes it can coincide with really important events that are happening in your life or really important transits that are happening in your chart. For example, you might have a really intense Saturn transit right now, right, in Capricorn. And when the sun comes through Libra and makes a square to that Saturn, I, for example, have a client I spoke with this past week who's in the midst of a Saturn return, second Saturn return. And that second Saturn return is really amping up right now as it's barely moving, kind of just starting to get direct again, and is in the midst of the exact degree of the Saturn return. And now this fall equinox moment is with Mercury and the sun are square to Saturn and really amplifying the themes of her Saturn return. Those planets are playing a very important role in the events that are unfolding right now. So some of the most critical events can sometimes, of larger transits, can sometimes be activated or triggered by the faster moving transits of the planets. And one of them that I always consider, like you would a full moon or a new moon, or a big aspect in the sky of some kind between two planets, would be an equinox. So an equinox is something to pay attention to always. Let's talk about what this equinox is and what it means. The fall equinox, first of all, people always ask this. They're always like, but I live in the southern hemisphere. It's not the fall equinox here. It's the spring equinox or something like that. Very, very valid point and concern that people often have. And they'll sort of say, well, what do I make of this then? If I'm in the southern hemisphere. Well, I have a way of answering this for myself. I've heard different astrologers have different answers to this over time, but the one that satisfies me the most goes like this. There are many different divinatory languages, like the calculation of your horoscope through Indian astrology, or through the Chinese zodiac, or through tarot cards, or through runes, or any number of divinatory systems out there. They're all languages that help us to access true and accurate descriptions and predictive knowledge about our lives. One of the most important things that we do in order to make a divinatory system work for us is we practice it consistently over a long period of time, using loosely or we use roughly the same set of ideas and methodologies. So a lot of the times in astrology, you'll study a lot of different things, and then you'll come to find something that works for you, like a tradition or a set of techniques or methods, or an astrologer that you really like that has a way of doing things. And then you sort of entrain yourself to that methodology. And then a lot of the times it starts working. It starts being able to give you very accurate descriptions or predictions in your work with other people. And so your natural inclination is to say, well, this must be the real one. This must be the only valid or legitimate form of astrology. But then mysteriously, someone who practices a slightly different form of astrology, or a slightly different form of tarot, or some other form of divinatory language, also gets great results. And so then all of these debates ensue about what the correct system is and how to, like that, and how are we all getting results. And the answer that's always made the most sense to me is that divination is really what's happening is a form of divination, which is meaning that the ritual apparatus and technology of the systems that we use facilitate conversation with higher levels of information or knowledge. So the symbolism of a system provides that for us. And again, what's really needed is consistent and logical, sort of interpenetrating set of rules and ideas about how to read and a symbolic language. And consistency within that over a long period of time is what sort of entrains you to being able to use a language accurately. But when people ask, well, it's a fall equinox, so what about the southern hemisphere? Here's what I say. I say, so taken into consideration that that's how I see astrology, then it's very important to mention that the language of the system of horoscopic astrology, which comes from the northern hemisphere in a particular time, place, and circumstance, that language, that divinatory language, is oriented symbolically from a particular view of the sky from a particular place on Earth. And when you participate in that system, you are orienting yourself in terms of its orientation. So you're stepping into its orientation. And when you step into its orientation, it still has the power to accurately describe your life. You don't have to, in other words, create an entirely new Southern Hemisphere centric version of astrology to speak accurately. And so the seasonal dynamics of astrology, which are Northern Hemisphere centric, are symbolic and divinatory, and that's how they should be understood, rather than thinking about them as literal and sort of empirically scientific, and therefore needing an entirely new system to address things like the fall equinox in the southern hemisphere, or the spring equinox in the southern hemisphere, or what have you. So that's how I address that. So in other words, when you're having somebody read your chart, and they're saying, you were born an Aries or something like that. You live in the southern hemisphere, and they're saying all of these things about your spring-like qualities, and you're going, well, I was born during the autumn, in the southern hemisphere. You really don't have to think about it that literally. Instead, just think to yourself that this language and the orientation of this symbolic divinatory language speaks to the essence of who I am in terms of a particular kind of, the spring-like qualities or whatever, but it doesn't have to do with the literal seasonal qualities that were happening around me when I was born, because it's a symbolic and divinatory language. Just like in the same way that if you draw a tarot card, and if a child was born and I threw down 12 tarot cards in a circle to give me an understanding about their character, the winter card might pop up as the main descriptor of their personality, even though they're born in the middle of summer, right? So it's the same idea, is that the seasonal language is archetypal and it's symbolic. It's not meant to be taken so literally that you need to reconfigure everything. So when we talk about fall equinox today, regardless of where you are in the world, it can be applicable on a symbolic level. And that's the way that I think about it. So because I'm also trying to avoid having to answer 20 emails from people that I may get afterward asking this question, I thought I'd take a moment to address it right away. Okay, so what is the fall equinox from the symbolic standpoint of astrology? Well, we're talking about the time of year when the sun moves into the dark half of the solar year, again, from the northern hemisphere standpoint. But symbolically, this is what matters. Darkness is about to take over for about 6 months, or 6 signs of the zodiac. We're on the dark half of the zodiac, from Libra all the way to Aries. Within the 24-hour day, now there will be more darkness than there is light. And so this is the yin time of year, where yin takes over, yin leads, yin rules. And the fall equinox moment represents time when the darkness, the yin, is taking over. It's a 50-50 moment, equal darkness, equal light. That's why it's called equinox. So we have equality in the air, so to speak, but the scales are tipping immediately. Once we enter, just a few days into Libra, sort of technically speaking, you'll have more darkness in the 24-hour period than you will light. So this transitional moment is very important on a symbolic level for all of us, because it basically, in a very general sense, ushers us into the underworld portion of the year. And that moment for the sun is especially important in astrology because that moment designates a time when the sun's essential dignity is greatly changing. So the sun's essential dignity is changing into the sign where it was said to be depressed or in its fall. What does that mean? Well, quite literally, that's where we sort of get the name fall from. We're talking about the fall of the sun. And if you watch in the sky, the arc of the sun from horizon to horizon, the ecliptic, which is kind of snaking its way through the sky sometimes, kind of an arch. Since the summer solstice, that daily arch where it was at the highest, creating the longest day of the year, has been dropping down in the sky so that the arc is getting closer and closer to the sort of southern horizon, which means that the day is going to happen much quicker. The sun will transit from east to west much more quickly. And so that creates a shorter day, but this is also the idea of the sun falling in the sky. And that fall is associated, again, with entrance into the underworld. And especially the critical turning point of the fall equinox is also not only associated with entry into the dark time of year, with yin taking over, and with the sun kind of dropping down the underworld, but it's also it's associated with the harvest. So this is the harvest time of year. And when the harvest time of year comes around in nature, we're thinking about we are reaping what's been sown. So over a long course of time, there's all sorts of, in sort of agricultural sense, there's things that are planted and then things that grow, and then you come to the harvest moment and you're reaping what's been sown. You're taking in your seeing what the yield is for the year, so to speak. And this is a process of evaluation, but it's also the beginning of a process of disintegration and the beginning of a process of death. And also it's a moment of evaluation and judgment. Why? Because you're seeing how well have we done? What has our work added up to? Will we make money on this harvest? And in a more spiritual sense, we're looking at what you're talking about the judgment of the soul upon entry into the underworld. So most religious traditions around the planet have some sense of that your actions in this life matter and are weighed in the afterlife, or determine to some extent where you go when you pass away from this body. And so for traditions that believe in reincarnation, this is shaping your actions in this life, shape future lives as well. The actions and consequences of actions in this life that we take don't just play out instantly. They have effects over very, very long periods of time that carry on beyond this form in this lifetime. And so the sense of judgment or evaluation of actions in the underworld that go into shaping in different ancient mythologies, we know what kind of body family you'll be born into next, what kind of situation or spiritual curriculum you might have in a next life, what type of spirit guide you may take with you into a next life. These are all different kinds of things that exist, or whether you'll go to ascend to a more heavenly state of consciousness, or go down to perhaps a denser state where you receive some level of purification. These are all elements of what ancient people thought about the evaluation moment of death and the soul entering the underworld, which is symbolized by this moment of passing into the darkness and the scales of Libra that reflect the scales of justice. And for example, in the Egyptian Hall of Ma'at, if I remember that correctly, the heart was weighed against a feather. And one instantly questions how it is that a heart could ever be lighter than a feather. But that's really the teaching and essence of that sort of mythological image, is that in the Egyptian Hall of Ma'at depiction, the heart of the individual must be, in a sense, lighter than a feather, which is a physical impossibility, but speaks to something spiritually possible. And when the heart is lighter than a feather, when the heart has, in a sense, become lighter than its physical reality, then that lightness carries it to a better destination. Whereas if it's heavier, the destination might be more punitive, or may require some, some corrections or teachings or something like that. Okay, but before we get into this, judgment, harvesting, dissolution, death, etc., we have a lot of people think of Libra. They always talk about how Libra is so polite, Libra is so kind, etc., etc. And this really doesn't get anywhere close to the heart of darkness that Libra really embodies, which we're going to talk about today. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the fall, going back to the idea of the sun and its fall. People sometimes ask, well, what does that mean? It sounds really bad, In ancient astrology, the sun entering its fall in Libra is intimately connected to the polar opposite sign of Aries, where the sun is said to be exalted. And similarly, the sun's natural sort of planetary contrary, Saturn, who represents darkness, whereas the sun represents light, is exalted in Libra, lifted up, whereas in Aries, where the sun is exalted, Libra or Saturn is in its fall. So you have this kind of complementary but oppositional symbolism between the sun and Saturn in Aries and Libra. Very important, because when the light is taking over at the spring equinox, then the sun is said to be exalted, because the light is taking over and the sun naturally represents light. Whereas when it's entering the underworld and the light is diminishing, it's more difficult for the sun. Whereas for Saturn, who rules darkness, this time of year is especially potent and uplifting for Saturn. You kind of get the best out of Saturn in Libra. Whereas when you place Saturn in Aries, the spring sign where light takes over, it's more difficult for Saturn to act like Saturn in a space that is more about those exalted spring-like qualities. So that dichotomy tells us in a natal chart, if you have the sun in Libra, it's not like, oh, you're so screwed, but it is that there is something about the sun's position in Libra that is more challenging for the sun to behave or act like itself than it would be in, say, Aries or Leo, which are its two natural homes, the beginning of spring and the middle of summer. So, but practically speaking, I always like to try to address this when I talk about Libra and the sun. The sun was traditionally associated with rulers and kings, and it long has had an affiliation with leadership and ego and will and a strong sense of self. So I pulled this book from my shelf to read you something today. Story time. This is a great book by Demetra George called Astrology and the Authentic Self, integrating traditional and modern astrology to uncover the essence of the birth chart. I love this book. I have it in my syllabus as one that I ask my students to read. It's really cool. Anyway, here's what she says. The sun is the domicile lord of the zodiacal sign Leo, which is associated with both the heart of the cosmic animal and the heart of the human being. Many medical schools of antiquity held that the mind was located in the heart. So first of all, remember that image of judgment in the underworld of the heart on the scale against the feather, and the heart needing to be lighter than the feather for the soul to essentially ascend. Keep that in mind. Many medical schools of antiquity held that the mind was located in the heart. In the 2nd century CE, the Hellenistic astrologer Vettius Valens wrote that the sun signifies the king, the soul, and the mind. In Mesopotamia, where astrology originated and was practiced for 2,000 years before it was taken up by the Greeks, astrologers were the priests who interpreted the movements of the planets as communications from the gods. They conveyed this information to the kings so that they might rule in accordance with divine intent. The ancient Greek philosophers understood the soul as the divine part of the human mind. In astrology, it is through the sun that the human mind has a direct link to the divine, and thus it is through the sun that the divine intention for the individual is most clearly indicated. Listen to what she says about the sun on the next page. The sun signifies the radiant core of a person's essence, the soul, the mind, and consciousness, the life force and vitality, the basic sense of selfhood, the purpose of life, and the source of the will for accomplishing that purpose. This is how I talk about the sun in my own practice, and this is the way that I teach the sun to my own students. Very similar language. Now, but what is the main point that I want to draw on from that passage? The reason that it's so difficult for the sun in the sign of Libra, or it can be in a natal chart, and not like, first of all, in modern astrology, this needs to be said first. In modern astrology, we tend to get personally identified with our sun sign. Not recommended. Not that there can't be symbolic resonance between your sun sign and who you are as a person. But the idea here in ancient astrology for many different kinds of astrologers was that your ego and everything that your birth chart reflects about you as an individual is like a temporary costume that you're wearing. You're an eternal spirit soul. You've come into a body complete with an ego, a temperament, a psychology, etc. But that's not really who you are. That's the clothes that you're wearing in a material sense. Those things are aspects of your costume. And so you wouldn't want to get overly identified with those things. So I say this because when you're interpreting the language of dignities in an ancient chart, if you're taking everything in your chart very personally, the language of dignities will be very offensive to you, because dignities is sort of describing the costume that you're wearing, and some elements of the costume are described as more challenging than others. They're described a little bit more objectively in that sense. And sun in Libra lots of people identify as Libras. That's a wonderful sun sign to have. There's nothing wrong with that. But from the standpoint of the ancient essential dignities language, the sun in Libra can represent a variety of challenging things for the following reasons. Your ego, or your sense of self that you have in this lifetime, is one of the things that it deals with, that we all deal with as people who have egos, is the idea or belief that, what defines our happiness is how powerful we are, how successful we are, how important we are, how intelligent or smart we are. And so the sun, in a sense, represents some of the potentially very unhealthy components of our ego. Our mind often has completely delusional ideas about what will bring it happiness, considering that what the mind is a representative of a supreme divine eternal soul, and that's who you actually are. From that standpoint, as Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, the mind is either your best friend or your worst enemy. It depends. Just like an ego can be a healthy servant to your higher self, or it can be a really troubling enemy. So similarly, one of the reasons that the sun can be so troubled in Libra is that this is a time of year when that ego and that mind, and especially its big delusions of living forever, lasting forever, being the topmost supreme, are dying, because the sun is going down into the underworld. And so it's very challenging for most of us, no matter how spiritually enlightened we think we are, to face the impermanence of our mind, of our personality. If you've ever watched a loved one grow old or die, like a grandmother, grandfather, or something like that, you'll see that it's not easy to let go of these clothes that we're wearing. And when you enter the underworld in ancient Greek mythology, you frequently see that people are stripped bare. They're stripped down naked. You go out of this world naked, and you come into this world naked. Everything is taken away. Nothing can come with us of this bodily existence. And that includes, in some sense, our ego and our personality and everything that we think makes us me. So it's difficult to relinquish those things or to let go of those things. And notice how, again, in ancient astrology, we'll just read this one more time, The sun is the domicile lord of the zodiacal sign Leo, which is associated with both the heart of the cosmic animal and the heart of the human being. Many medical schools of antiquity held that the mind was located in the heart. In the 2nd century CE, the Hellenistic astrologer Vettius Valens wrote that the sun signifies the king, the soul, and the mind. So you see, our heart is also the lens or conduit through which we may see everything in the world and put everything that we are in service of the soul. So the Vettius Valens, for example, talks about the sun as the agent of perception of the soul. And so the sun has this dual role. We can get deluded into thinking that's all I am is my sun. That's all I am is my mind. And my thoughts and my actions in the world are what completely define me, and that's it. There's nothing else. Or we can see our ego and our mind as in service to a higher self. And astrologers were thinking this thousands of years ago. And this is why the sun is paired with things that are both very mundane, like, in a sense, the mind, the personality, the ego, rank, fame, status, achievement, power. But it's also associated with the heart and the lens through which the soul may come to see or perceive itself and the world. So when that heart is being judged in the underworld, when the heart is weighed next to the feather, what we're trying to do is get that heart to be lighter than the feather. And how do you get a heart to be lighter than a feather? Well, that's what it means to put your heart, mind, body, everything in service to the soul. And the sense of living a life where our ego is a temporary servant of a higher self, that when we live in that way, it's as though our heart takes on a lightness. Our heart becomes lighter than just the physical stuff. We're no longer just the ego, just our job, just our power, just our smarts, whatever. We become lighter. And then we pass the test of the underworld. But this is a treacherous place for the sun, in a sense, because it's the place where kings die. It's the place where egos die. It's the place where we are judged. However, if there's lightness of spirit, if there is that sense of the ego being in service, then this is a place of incredible nobility, subtlety, and a sense of an ego that is existing in relation to something bigger than itself. And so psychologically, we can say that sometimes Libras represent, this is just like really gross characterizations, but you could say that Libras represent the epitome of vanity, right? That's the shadow side of Libras, like just the epitome of vanity. I am my clothing, I am my ego, and da-da-da-da-da. And I try to pretend as though my life is about all these high, lofty, noble, sweet, things, but really it's all about me. Try to make it, color it up to make it look like it's really elevated and noble, but it's really self-centered. And that's sort of the epitome of the dark side, psychologically speaking, of Libra, you might say. But on the other hand, the true, I would say, sort of spiritually elevated essence of Libra is the realization that I am in service to something bigger than myself. The other matters. The other plays a role in my life that matters. I am, in a sense, diminished in favor of we, and that starts not so much in a social dimension, but in an inner dimension. The ego is perceived as a temporary steward of the higher self. And so the real we of Libra on a spiritual level is as a steward of the soul. And that extends then socially and becomes social grace, social sophistication, diplomacy, tact, carefulness that really cares, that's really, in a sense, more egoless. But the sun has a very difficult time in this position for this reason. Now, Saturn, on the other hand, does really, really well here. Why does Saturn do so well in Libra? Well, in a sense, it's because Saturn is naturally a planet that understands darkness. Saturn naturally understands um, the value or virtue of that which is subtler, more invisible, less dominant. So, in a sense, let's say that you go out to a party and you're kind of becoming the center of attention in some way. And it's not so healthy, though. It's kind of egoic. You will tend to naturally attract. This happens. I've seen it happen so many times, especially in college when I was going to like, more social gatherings and stuff like that. People would be, you know, consuming alcoholic beverages or whatever, and someone would start becoming the life of the party. And then someone kind of in the corner, cast in the shadow, would sort of step forward and start sort of calling them out, sort of trying to diminish their light, sort of trying to negate that power and force of personality that was trying to take everything over. And that negation of that light, it would be, and I would always, it was like before I knew that I really loved astrology, I loved it because I loved these kinds of dynamics. I loved watching them unfold socially and within myself and just noticing the patterns. And I was studying literature in school. So at the time, I just thought, well, this is all just literary. Like we're all just living characters and stories. And I found out there was actually an esoteric language and sort of esoteric spiritual science around it. I mean, imagine how excited I was. So at any rate, but that person that comes out of the shadows and tries to negate the big ego, that's Saturn. Saturn, and sometimes it's the person who's, doing something good or noble. And a Saturn will step out and try to blot out the light in a kind of malefic way. And that's not good, But one of the reasons that Saturn does so well in Libra is because Saturn loves to negate. And Saturn, one of Saturn's main ways that it negates the ego is to diminish light in favor of darkness. And that can be a very, very good thing, which is why Saturn was traditionally associated with contemplatives and mystics. Because as you are walking on any mystical path, any kind of spiritual path, the first sort of noble truth is usually the realization of impermanence and suffering, the diminishment or death of the ego that comes in. And you say, you're not the measure of all things. Your life is not the most important. You're not the center of everything. Things that you think you need or want don't bring you as much happiness as you think they will, and nothing really lasts. Those realizations, when you first have them, are painful. You know what I mean? Like those are painful things to encounter. But the limits, the appearance of what appears to be a limit in time becomes your friend. In time, the negation is also in the same way that a sculptor or a wood carver chops away at something in order to shape something into more of what it essentially is. Negation plays the role in our lives. When we get a no, it helps shape us into more of what we essentially are. By knowledge of what you are not, you have more knowledge of what you are. They go together. You can't have one without the other, though. Sometimes people get stuck in cynical Saturn mode, and all they want to do is just judge and negate everything, and they believe that in and of itself is a valid, spiritual path, that they never need to assert anything positive, in a sense, that just the negation is enough. And I always take issue with those kinds of people when I meet them, because to me, it's there's an ongoing dialectical that has to take place between being something positive and having something constantly stripped back and pulling back and cutting away at things. And so that dialectical, I think, has to be alive in all of us. But that's really the reason that Saturn is exalted in Libra, whereas it's greatly diminished in its fall in Aries. Because in Aries, think of Saturn trying to say no to just the roaring, like, steam and sunshine of spring. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's very hard for Saturn to do its thing there. And so frequently when you get a Saturn in Aries, you will see people who either struggle greatly with a feeling of like impotency or ineffectiveness. Like, I can't say no to things. I have no discipline. I have no spine. I have no backbone. That kind of Saturn thing just feels like it's really weak. Or you will see people who go to the opposite extreme. They overcompensate and they become like wildly dictatorial and sort of authoritarian. But either way, it's the difficult relationship with negation that exists in Aries. Whereas Saturn in Libra can make those judgments, but do it in a way that's very fair and reasonable and considerate and careful. And so you get a much more sort of refined and elevated Saturn. So Saturn in Libra does really well. The Sun in Libra, on the other hand, it's much more challenging because the Sun's natural thing is to be, and the other way of thinking about it is like this. The sun rules the daytime world. What's happening in the daytime world? Well, in the daytime world, the daylight starkly defines the contrast between things. That's a tree, that's a car, that's a person, and that's a house. And everything is very clearly defined. And so there's a very strong sort of sense of self that comes with the daytime, right? We have this very concrete, individualized sense of beingness and the importance of our individual story during the daytime hours. We're off to work in the world. I've got things to do. I have things to take care of. I have a story I'm living. What happens during the nighttime? All of that gets relinquished. In the nighttime, you sit around fires and the moonlight comes out and everything swims together. Now you can't tell the difference so much between your shadow and another person and the light and the dark and the tree and the car, and everything's swimming together a little bit more. Well, in that realm, the other naturally comes forth more. We look at the stars, and rather than just seeing the singular image of the sun, we see the multiplicity of the stars. We see the multiplicity of shadow and light. We see the diversity of darkness. And so Saturn is more naturally attuned with that world than the sun is. As much as we love to hate on Saturn, in a sense, Saturn's exaltation in Libra is also telling us about how to get in touch with the otherness of things. And that has to take place in the darkness. Why is Libra the scales of justice, also often symbolized by Lady Justice with her eyes blindfolded? Because to really judge and evaluate the essence of things, you have to have a kind of nocturnal awareness. In order to really judge the essence of things, you can't just look at their sunny side, their day side appearance. That literalness of the day world, while it's bright and it has its own virtues and its own beauty, is also often guilty of looking only at the literal, only at the concrete. Whereas in the evening, when darkness falls, we see into the heart of things. We are reminded that light is something that we see by means of, and that by means of light we see into the heart of things. And in the daytime world, it's a little harder to remember that because light is so dominant. But in the darkness, the light and dark have more of a complementary relationship with each other, which is why you say light is something that I see by means of. Light is a tool, a guide, something that gives me the ability to see. But what I see is not just literal. There's a variation of tone and quality that we see in the darkness. Saturn rules that time, and that's also why Libra and the sun's fall and Saturn's exaltation in Libra are all connected to this idea of justice being blind. So one of the things that Librans classically struggle with, for example, is the inability to judge fairly between things when there is not a pre-existing, very clear criteria by means of which to judge something. So when a Libra sometimes has to make in other words, a more personal, subjective, or subtle judgment or evaluation of something, sometimes they will struggle greatly with indecision. And one of the reasons for that is that, again, this is a place where, especially with the sun in Libra, where it's hard to see without the literalness of sight. It's hard to get into the inner essence of something to make a fair and real judgment. So really good judges, right, in the ideal sense, are people who use the law as a tool. And the tool of the law is used to evaluate the inner essence of something. Is it right? Is it true? Is it real? Is our testimonies being manipulated? Is the law being manipulated? And the judge has a combination of knowledge of the external law combined with a kind of insight. That's what makes a sort of wise, fair judge. And then the penalty fits the crime. Do you know what I mean? So, again, Saturn's exaltation in Libra has to do with all of those kinds of issues. Saturn's very good at doing those kinds of things in Libra, whereas the sun will struggle a little bit more. And the way that sometimes comes out in pop psychology is the sense of Libras being indecisive. But the other thing that's very true is about Libra is that, back to the vanity thing, sometimes, very similarly, when we only know how to judge or evaluate something based on its external appearance, we also struggle because, in a sense, that means that we're caught up in vanity. So sometimes Libras are charged with being sort of vain or PC or polite and like fake or something like that. You'll hear those kind of criticisms leveled at Librans. And there's a real struggle there. And one of the real struggles is that who am I on the level of inner essence? And that's hard to do, especially for the sun in Libra, because you're learning how to see, in a sense, in the darkness. The sun's normal, just sort of everything is the way it is in the daytime world is diminished, and you have to go into a subtler realm. And that struggle is often, we perceive it on the outside, as people observing a Libran or Libra energy or something. We observe it and we're like, oh my gosh, it seems like it's just fake. But just try to have compassion, because what you're also doing is, in a sense, you're teaching the blind man to see. It's like becoming blind and having to learn how to see all over again. You're acutely aware of the external normal ways that beauty, grace, truth, politeness, everything is evaluated in a very literal, linear sense. And yet, internally, it's not always exactly like that. And so you have to calibrate to get the two on the same page. This also gets down to the basic idea that Libra is a Venus-ruled sign. So Venus is a planet that I talked about earlier this week in a little talk that I gave on Venus's upcoming retrograde. But Venus's original name was Phosphorus, which means self-illumined. When Venus was born from the foam of the ocean, she is immediately adorned and covered in beautiful things. One of the things that we often mistake, or one of the things that we deal with, both Taurus and Libra deal with this as signs, is that there is a difference between the external coverings of Venus and the internal essence. So, for example, Venus is associated with cleanliness, right? But, and also with piety, religiously speaking, and with the ceremonial beauty and sort of decor of a well-kept altar. So if you have a beautiful altar in your home that's like decked out in beautiful flowers and images and everything like that, the external coverings are an element of Venus. But what Venus is, the reason that Venus is associated with altars is because it's said that the external coverings of things, when we adorn things, what we do is we amplify and enhance the ability of the inner essence to come forward. So what are you trying to get to come forward from an altar? The spirit. You're trying to get the channel of divinity opened up so that it can come through and speak. This is why we adorn altars with beautiful things. But it's Venus's role to bring forth the self-illumined spirit through the vehicle of harmony, grace, beauty, aesthetics, flowers, friendship. You know what I mean? So there's two layers to Venus always. There's the inner phosphorus, the inner self-illumined, and then there's the external coverings that somehow bring that out. But the duality within Venus is often suffered by both Taurians and Librans in the same way, where there's a struggle with superficiality, where if you get caught up in just the external coverings without phosphorus, the self-illumined, coming forth from within them, if your relation to external beauty, external politeness, external friendliness, etc., is not done in order to bring out the inner divine essence, bringing it in and through, then you will be charged with vanity. People will see through you, and they will see vacuousness behind the external. This is also why the sun, in a sense, is in its fall in Libra, or struggles in Libra. These are the themes that it's working through. But again, can we call forth some compassion? Every single sign of the zodiac and every single planet has dualities working like this within it, and we are all beings who are learning very similar lessons in, different valences, different forms. So this is a lesson we all learn. It really doesn't matter if your sun's in Libra or not. Everybody has a house ruled by Libra. Everybody's Venus somewhere in their chart, right? We all go through this time of year, no matter where you live. So we all know what it's like to go through this kind of challenge or struggle. But on the other hand, when you really do learn when you learn how to put the heart and to put the outer in service of the inner spirit soul, something really amazing happens. Let's go back to what Demetra said. Here's what Demetra says. In Mesopotamia, where astrology originated and was practiced for 2,000 years before it was taken up by the Greeks, astrologers were the priests who interpreted the movements of the planets as communications from the gods. So think about this for a second. How often do we try to adorn ourselves very personally with everything in our charts? My Venus, my sun, my moon, my Mars, like it's our costume, and we take total pride in thinking that's what I am. This is why I was saying earlier, not so great to get so personally identified, because astrologers were the priests who interpreted the movements of the planets as communications from the gods. These are messengers, indicators of divine forces. And so they don't belong to us. They say something to us. They convey something to us. Here's what she says next. They conveyed this information to the kings so that they might rule in accordance with divine intent. What is the ideal of a king? Just like the ideal of an ego, it is to be in service to this higher self, or to the soul. So similarly, the role of the astrologer is to inform the king so that they might rule in accordance with divine intent. The Libra is very much associated with this idea that when we take the externals, the messages from the external world, like the astrologer interpreting the planets, and we bring them to the king, the ego, then the ego can be in service to the higher self. So similarly, all of astrology is really a reflection of the challenges laid forth in the sign of Libra, the equinox threshing ground of the fall. We have the chance to reconfigure our understanding of what is real and what is superficial. We have a chance to reconfigure our understanding of what our ego is and what its true position is. We have the ability to start judging the inner essence of things, or getting back to the inner essence of things, and putting things in service of something bigger than ourselves. So that's a really a great way of thinking about it. There's this, of course, was exemplified often in ancient astrology in the way that kings and astrologers had relationships with one another, which could often be very treacherous, speaking of the sun and its fall in Libra. There's a story, and I first heard this from Chris Brennan in one of his lectures. And I believe it was, might get this wrong, but it was Emperor Tiberius who was basically looking to employ an astrologer, and the astrologer Thrasyllus wrote about this encounter that he had, where he was brought to the edge of a cliff for an interview. This is his job interview to become the emperor's astrologer. And the emperor asks him to, lay down some predictions about his life, which he does. And, and if they were successful or whatever, then he says, okay, now you give me some interpretations about your life. And unbeknownst to the astrologer, what would happen is the astrologer, if they did not predict that they were in imminent danger, they would be thrown off a cliff. They would be thrown right off the cliff. And that was the way of testing the astrologer's knowledge in the reverse direction. So they weren't just saying, things that the king wanted to hear or whatever. So Thrasyllus he says, now look at your own chart. Tell me what you see. And he says, it looks like I'm in imminent danger. And he says, okay, you're hired. So I heard that story from Chris Brennan, and that story has always stuck with me ever since, because it's a great example of that treacherous relationship between the servant and the king. And the truth is that being honest with ourselves, having real insight as to what is real and what's superficial, and is treacherous, because the king doesn't always like what the servant has to say. And for the king to become a servant of the higher will, there's also a kind of deep, treacherous level of honesty that's needed, and a sort of abnegation of one's sovereignty. And we live in a world where everyone loves to talk about personal authority. But think about it like this. Everyone loves to talk about personal authority, mostly because people don't like the idea of being under the thumb of somebody else, understandably, right? But authority only makes sense if you have authority over something. You have some command or power or say over something. So by suggesting that all power lies within the individual, we're not doing away with the idea that there are still hierarchies or relationships of power that can be very treacherous. So if you have power, or you're the agent, you're the divine sovereign, you're the buck stops here, you're in charge of everything, then essentially you still have the ability to impact an entire field of otherness around you. And I don't think most of us are equipped to know exactly how to interact perfectly in every instance so that we don't abuse our authority or power. And so to me, it's always made more sense to think of ourselves as having some allotment of power, some allotment of sovereignty. Just like a bird has the ability within its field of activities to exercise its free will within certain parameters, each of our lives, defined by karma, fate, what have you, have a certain amount of sovereignty, a certain amount of free will. But we also have to be accountable for our actions, for the free will that we use, for the way that we exercise authority or power. And there are consequences. And Libra also reminds us of that, because Libra is one of the classic signs of karmic evaluation. It's a time of year where it's really good to start evaluating your actions and what their effects have been on others, what the consequences are for yourself, and understanding that there is a subtle education that takes place. How does one even learn to begin judging things beyond just their superficial appearances? It begins when you start paying very close attention to what the ramifications of your actions have been in life, and you start studying them on a subtler level. What have my actions created? What kinds of consequences have they given me and others? And when you start evaluating that and taking responsibility for that, that's when you naturally start to diminish the ego and become a little bit more of a servant. But in order to do that, you kind of have to buck the authority of the emperor, who thinks I'm always and only the only thing that matters. So that's a big part of what Libra gets at as well. I believe that gets through all of the points that I had on my list for today. The other thing, there's one more thing: balance. A lot of people, when they get to Libra, they talk about balance, the scales of justice, but also balance and fairness and sort of like equality. Well, there's two very important levels to Libra. One is the real inner spiritual essence of the idea of equality. And then one is the worldly sense of equality. Again, you have a duality inherent in Libra. The worldly sense of equality and the spiritual sense of equality are not the same. They're not equal. Spiritual equality, for example, the way that our Constitution was written, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, our founding fathers in the United States had a metaphysical idea behind the founding of the system of democracy, and that was that all people are created equal. Okay, well, That's not apparent if you just look at the physical, right? If you look at the physical world, nothing in the physical world says that back to you so readily. Some people are born very fast. Some people are born very slow. Some people are very intelligent. Other people have a really difficult time learning. Some people are intelligent in ways that aren't about books, and some people are intelligent in ways that are about using their hands. Nothing in this world, in the way that we're born, from physical descriptions to inherent gifts or capacities, says equality, says everyone's equal. And to some extent, in the world doesn't behave at all in a sense naturally as though everybody's equal. People are constantly taking advantage of one another. People are constantly struggling and competing like this. So the material world is, doesn't perfectly reflect this idea of equality. But why do we value it? Why do we value it anyway? Because on a spiritual level, as spirit souls, as sentient beings, we believe in the idea that we are all equal on that level, that we all are we all are made in the same divine stuff, that we're all a part of the same divine whole, that we all exist in relation to that whole, that we're all spirit souls, however you want to look at it. That's what that's really about. So there's, in that sense, there again is a division between the idea of who we are as spirit souls and who we are as material beings. Unfortunately, we have a really hard time reconciling the two of those things, right? Because sometimes we believe in this world that happiness is only found if I achieve some kind of externalized sense of perfect equilibrium or balance. I have my checkbook balanced, I have my life balanced, I have my physical health balanced, I have, the inside of my refrigerator is balanced, my friendships are balanced, my career is balanced. And balance becomes like, balance becomes nothing more than an Instagram, photo of someone making a beautiful meal, looking lean and slender and sexy in a yoga pose, and with, the perfectly done Photoshop image of themselves in a spiritual quote advertising the next retreat they're going to lead. Right? when balance becomes externalized in the material world, we do a disservice to both the spiritual sense of equality and the material reality, because the material world is always moving and it's always changing. The scales are always going up and down, and rarely does a moment of perfect balance between the scales last for very long. No, it keeps going like this. And yet we rail and rail and rail and become like manic about trying to make the external balanced. That's another problem that we can have in the sign of Libra. On the other hand, when we end, for example, let's just spell this out a little bit more. This can happen not only in the sense of beauty and vanity and personal, I'm personally balanced and perfect, but it also exists socially and culturally. More and more, our advertising is starting to pick up on the idea that we'd like to be living balanced lives. So rather than, advertising catering to our desire to go to some extreme, advertisers have picked up on the fact at times that we're becoming a little more skeptical of consumerism and the frenzy of material pursuits. And so they just start shifting the advertising to be like, you want to live a balanced and healthy life, You go into any grocery store these days, and you really need a decoder ring to be able to, and so my wife, thank God for her, because she really she has this keen ability to see. I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh, this must be good. It says, it says it's organic or whatever. And my wife's like, and then she'll break down for me exactly what everything means. But so many of the images of balance and health and beauty are being peddled to us culturally in ways that are really sneaky and disingenuous, because everyone's trying to sell that image. Or similarly, even though I personally, as a personal political animal, I happen to believe that we need to be concerned about social justice. I also really struggle when I see this sort of utopian idealism where sometimes people are totally out of balance personally in rage and reactivity and accusation and just negative. And yet everything that they're saying they're doing is about, social justice or social balance or something like that. And I personally don't. I think that there's a role for like sort of righteous anger, and there's a force behind social justice that needs to be there to make change. I get it, but you know what I'm saying? Like sometimes I scroll through social media and I think how how ignorant it is to think that this material world will ever reach some ideal place. It's just as fruitless as thinking that your body will ever be some kind of perfectly balanced place. And that can really grate on me. And I sort of have to tune out of some of these charged political conversations, because on either side of any debate about any topic, I often find that there is a relentless form of idealism that's just not in touch with the way that the material world works, which is fluctuation and change all the time. People holding others to standards ethically, morally, politically, etc., that frankly we don't hold ourselves to, and that are just impossible to maintain 24/7 because of the way that the material world works, which is to be in fluctuation between opposites constantly. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't be socially active and that there isn't a place for action. And there's Mars after all, right? But you get what I'm saying. That there's extensions of the problem of perfect balance in the material world everywhere. And learning to live with some element of suffering, learning to accept the anticlimactic nature of fighting for justice is a part of what allows a person to do it without exhausting themselves. So similarly, on the other side, that idea of spiritual equality, which is informing our desire for things to be fair on the material level, right? Like the Constitution is created, and we're trying to create a society that more closely resembles spiritual equality. But how do we live our life with the sense of spiritual equality? Well, again, that takes a way of recalibrating our life to try to bring out inner essence, to try to see others as we see ourselves, to love others as we love ourselves, to see compassion and to see compassionately and to feel spiritual equality among sentient beings in the world. It requires a readjustment of our values and our prioritizations, and that will carry over into how we do things in the material world, from health and wellness and the way that we treat our bodies and everything else like that. But the thing is that when you start with the idea of your inner spiritual essence and source, and when you start with the idea that you are equal on all levels with everybody else like that, that kind of equality also has as its birthright the inherent qualities of knowledge, bliss, and eternality. So who we are is already all that it needs to be. And so when we start from that place and when we recognize that in everything else, then we can act in the material world in a way that tries to bring the material standard up, bring the vibration up, as they say, but we do it with a patience. We do it with an insight that everything is already equal on a spiritual plane. Everything is already rooted in that common essence that we share. And in that essence, we are everything that we already need, and nothing is missing or wrong. That vision starts to color the process of how we adjust the externals. It gives us more patience. It gives us more tolerance. It gives us more humility. It gives us more insight into how to make systemic changes. But it has to start from that place, because that place is already everything that it needs to be. Whereas if we start with the external and try to make it perfect, it's an exercise in futility. So that's what I wanted to say about balance. That's what I've got for today. I hope that this was an interesting kind of meditation on the sign of Libra. There was up over 100 people here at one point, which is really cool. I hope that this was interesting for everybody, and I'll look and see if there's any questions now. Let's see, I'm going back up to the top. Nice to see everybody saying some highs and waves and stuff like that. Good. I don't see any questions so far. Lots of nice comments. Thank you guys for the nice affirmations of this talk today. Yes, stewardship is such a valuable concept. Yeah. But really applying the negation ideas, you've reframed it for me. Oh, good. Good. Very good. Well, thanks, guys. That's what I've got for everybody. Happy fall equinox. I hope that you all have a lovely day today. Remember that the moon is in Pisces, and so there's a secret compatibility between Pisces and Libra. Venus is exalted in the sign of Pisces in its rulership in Libra, and there's an antitia between Libra and Pisces. So there's a sort of secret marriage between the sun and the moon today that's really beautiful. Look for that. Look for the marriage between the inner essence and your external stuff today. And I hope you all have a great upcoming week as well. I'll be touching back in the next few days. Take care, everyone.